Well, thank you all for coming today. It is a pleasure to be with you. You know, as Joe was saying, education is sort of my pastime. It's my vocation. It's what I'm passionate about, and so I love talking to groups about education. And I'm particularly interested in private school and school choice issues, as well as just traditional public school education. So I go to talk to a lot of groups about private schools, and I oftentimes get a question that you may have heard as well. So anytime I talk about giving families options to use public dollars to attend private schools, there's always one question that comes up. Isn't that just a voucher? So this is a question that I often hear. And people use this question to sort of do two things. Before I say what those two things are, I just want to point out a few pictures that I pulled up online when I searched for private school vouchers or school choice. You could see that there are some negative stereotypes about vouchers and about private school choice. You see vouchers taking bricks away from the public schools, or the voucher here in California is going to destroy the public schools. And so there are really some negative stereotypes about vouchers and school choice. And I really think that this question that people ask is a rhetorical device, right? So it's a way of arguing. It's a way of doing a couple things. The first thing it does is it takes all types of private school choice programs and it lumps them all together. So if you come up with any different way of giving kids public dollars to use to attend private schools, even though those programs may be very different, it takes all those programs and lumps them together, and then it just dismisses them with this word that has somewhat of a negative connotation. So it's very effective rhetorically. You give a really good presentation about a private school choice program, and someone says, well, isn't that just a voucher? And you just have lost the argument because they have very effectively dismissed everything you've just said. And if you don't think vouchers have a negative stereotype, I'll refer you back to the pictures I just showed. There is, in some circles, a very negative stereotype of vouchers. So today, I want to explain some of the differences between the different types of programs that states are using to allow students to use public dollars to attend private schools. And I will have a paper with the same title coming out later this month that you could look forward to and find on our website. We'll be sending out through email as well. So if you don't get our emails, you should sign up with Paul at some point afterwards. So right now I'm gonna do the teacher thing. So I'm gonna tell you what I'm gonna tell you, and then I'll tell you, and then later on I'm going to tell you what I just told you. Okay, so what I hope to do today is explain the differences between the different types of voucher programs. And I want to explain, why is it even important? Why does it matter? Are there benefits that we could receive if students use vouchers or some other type of school choice program to attend private schools? What does the literature say on that? And then I'll conclude with some, like I said, telling you what I just told you. So to start off, there are three types of programs in place currently in states that allow students to use public dollars to attend private schools. And the one everyone knows about is vouchers. That's the term we often hear. That's a term that sometimes has a negative connotation. There are also programs called tax credit scholarships and education savings accounts. So let me take them one at a time. So first, vouchers. The way we think about vouchers is somewhat like this. This is how the dollars flow in a voucher system. So you have a taxpayer who pays their money to the government in the form of taxes. Then the government decides who's eligible for vouchers and allows the students, sets a voucher amount and allows the student's family to choose a private school. So I technically could probably put the individual here, but the individual then gets to direct that money to a private school. So it's not that the government is just willy-nilly handing out money to the private schools, but through the parents' discretion of which school they choose, the taxpayer dollars go to the government and then flow to the private school. So that's what we typically think of as vouchers. And vouchers aren't new. They've been around for quite a while. The oldest voucher programs have been around in the United States for over 140 years. In Maine and Vermont and some of the rural parts of the states, they don't have public high schools, and so they will allow students to use one of these town tuitioning vouchers to attend a private school. But the modern concept of vouchers, what we think about more recently, really stemmed from this idea that Milton Friedman presented in the 1950s. And what he argued was that just because we agree kind of as a society that we need public education, right? We've established that we have compulsory attendance laws. We've established that we are generally okay with public financing of education as a society. And he says, you know, we could debate that issue if we wanted, but we've basically agreed on those principles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because we want a good public education, that the government has to also operate those schools. What he's saying is we could have public financing of education and also have private provision of education by allowing parents to take those dollars in the form of a voucher to attend the private school of their choice. So he really comes up with this modern idea of vouchers. And even though he started this idea in the 1950s, the first really modern systems of vouchers don't take place till the 1990. And I'm sorry you can't see this, it's kind of small, but starting in Wisconsin in 1990 was the first voucher program, modern voucher program. We now have 14 voucher programs. Mississippi just started one in 2012. And as you could see, or maybe you can't see, the largest program has about 23,000 students. And the smaller programs have, you know, a couple hundred students. And I believe the Mississippi program this year has just 25 students. And that's partly because of how they designed the voucher program. So we see voucher programs starting after 1990 to take root, and they're often targeted to specific populations. So they'll start a voucher program for students with special needs, to allow those families to choose a school that might be able to meet their child's needs, maybe better than their kid's traditional public school. Or some of these voucher programs are targeted to students in failing schools. So you're in a really low performing school, we're going to give you a voucher to attend a private school of your choice. So a lot of these programs are targeted to certain populations. So that's what we traditionally think of as vouchers. That's the traditional model, okay? But it's not the only model, it's not the only way that we can give students public dollars to attend private schools. So tax credit scholarships are another quite popular method that states are using to allow students to use those dollars to attend private schools. So the way that the money flows in this is slightly different. So instead of the taxpayer just giving their taxes to the government, in a tax credit scholarship system, they could say, I'm going to give, you know, some money to this or this scholarship granting organization. And so when I give $100 to them, the state gives me a credit against those dollars. And those credits vary. Some states have a 40% credit. Some have a much higher percentage credit. That depends on the state. But when I donate to that organization, I get a credit against my taxes. So I have less that I pay to the government in taxes. So the dollars in a tax credit scholarship program that go to the private school never actually go into the government hands. So they flow to the scholarship granting organization rather than to the government. And then that scholarship granting organization then awards scholarships to students to attend private schools. So it's similar to a voucher in the fact that, yes, public dollars are used to allow students to attend private schools, but it's different in how the money is allocated, and it's also different where the money comes from. So in a voucher program, the money might be the education funding that's just transition, follows the student to the school of their choice. It might be additional allotment of money that the student then gets to use. But in a tax credit scholarship program, that money comes from private donations to the tax scholarship or to the tax credit organization that grants the scholarships. So it's quite different in the way we think about funding these scholarships for students. So tax credit scholarships or tax credits you can design these systems in a bunch of different ways. You can design it so that the individual can get a tax credit when they donate to one of these organizations, or a corporation can get the tax credit when they donate. It could be worth a varying amount, as I mentioned. You could have 100% credit where you give $100, you get $100 back off of your taxes. It could be worth 40%. It could be worth whatever the legislature or the organization, whoever determines what this is going to be can set that amount. And like I said, these are deducted from your tax liability. And what states often do, because especially if you have a very generous tax deduction, you might get a whole lot of money donated to these scholarship granting organizations. And when you do that, it lowers the individual's tax liability, which means less money goes into general revenue. And so what states often do is they put caps in place. So they might say, all right, you as an individual can only donate X% of your total tax liability, or X amount of dollars. Or the individual corporation can only donate this amount. Or as a state, we can only collect X amount of dollars. So they can put caps in place to keep these programs relatively small and reasonable, where they're not unwieldy and destroying state budgets. But they can also, when they design these programs, put into place a way for the amount of the dollar amount that's collected to grow over time, to adjust with inflation. And one of the ways they do this is called an escalator. So let's say they set a cap, and this year we meet the cap. Next year the dollar amount of the cap automatically increases. And so there are lots of different ways that you could design a tax credit scholarship or even a voucher. So as I describe these three overarching programs, realize that within each of these programs, they can be very different depending on how a state designs them. Okay? And the design of the program is very important. So tax credit scholarships are not as prevalent as vouchers, but we see them in Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Rhode Island, Arizona. I think I re-mentioned some of these. Some states have multiple programs. Georgia and Indiana. The largest program is over 40,000 students, and some of the small ones, again, have just a couple hundred. So part of that, again, goes to how they design the program. If you have a targeted program for a small select group of students, it makes sense that that program is going to be smaller. But if you allow the program to serve a broader group of students, the program is going to be able to grow larger. So we've described now vouchers and tax credit scholarships. This next program is relatively new. Arizona just passed this in 2011, and they're called education savings accounts. So the dollars in the education savings account flow much like it does through a voucher system. You have the taxpayer who gives money to the government. The government, however, instead of the child choosing a school and going wherever they want to go and then the government sending the money to that school, when a student's eligible for an education savings account, that money flows into an account that's controlled by the individual. At Show Me Institute, we have health savings accounts. You might be familiar with these. So my employer puts money into a health savings account. I then purchase my own health insurance, and when I want to go to the doctor, I could pay for anything out of my health savings account. And I could use it for prescription drugs, I could use it for doctor's office visits, all kinds of things that I could use the health savings account for. The education savings account is a lot like this. So the money goes into this parent-directed education savings account, but then it's not limited in where I can spend it. I've got an EBT card that I can go and I could spend at Walmart to purchase textbooks, or I could go online and purchase educational testing services. So if I wanted my student to take a pre-SAT or something along those lines, I could purchase that. If I wanted to go to Kumon to get some tutoring or someplace to get my kids some extra help in math, whatever the state approves, I could use that education savings account to pay for those things. And one of the things I could pay for is private school. But like I said, this isn't limited to private schools through an education savings account. If you wanted to purchase an individual course through one private school that's offering a certain course that you like and a public school someplace else, if you want to homeschool your students and you want to purchase some different tutoring services, textbooks, those types of things, there are lots of uses with an ESA. And when I say ESA, I mean Education Savings Account. An Education Savings Account came about, as I said, just in 2011. Matt Ladner, who's an education policy expert, says the ESAs bring Milton Friedman's original school voucher idea into the 21st century. And the ESAs are really available because of technology, because we now have the ability to distribute the funds into these accounts electronically. We now have the ability to spend those dollars electronically. But we also have a lot more ability to customize education. Now, I was in graduate school. Joe shared a little bit that my background is in elementary education. Okay, so I have a bachelor's and master's degree in elementary education. I taught elementary school. The highest math course I ever took before I got to college, or before I got to graduate school, I should say, was college algebra for educators. So it was an easier version of algebra. My first PhD course was math for economic analysis in the econ department. I had not seen a beta or a gamma or a delta before, okay? I went into that class not knowing the letters that the professor is writing on the board. So what did I do? I went online. I started downloading courses from MIT OpenCourseWare. And I was learning from some great MIT professors about linear algebra. I went online to Khan Academy, started downloading exercises from Khan Academy and teaching myself through there, trying to catch up for this course. We really have a lot of ability now to not have to deliver education in the same way we've been delivering education. And so ESAs provide a little bit more flexibility where parents can do just that, customize the education and purchase different things from different places. And like a health savings account, if you don't spend it all, the money remains in the account. I could use it next year. This is really important because if you know anything about schools, you know high school is more expensive than elementary school. And so if you can bank those dollars for high school, you can cover the cost of tuition at high school. If you can bank them even further, you could save it for college tuition. So the ESA works like a voucher, but gives people more flexibility in how they spend those dollars. All right, so we now know the 3 different types of programs. So if anyone ever says to you, isn't that just a voucher? You can say, well, actually, there are some differences here that you should know. But so you know the differences. But what does it all mean? What does this even matter? Well, I think it does. If we look at the impacts of private school choice, I think we'll see that there are a lot of benefits we could receive from allowing students to use one of these options. So there have been 10 gold standard studies on the use of vouchers to attend private schools. And here's what I mean by gold standard. If I just wanted to evaluate how effective a private school is, I would say, okay, I've got these students here in a private school and I've got these students in a public school, let's see how they do. The obvious problem there is that the students in the private school might be different than the students in the public school, right? The students that selected into the private school might have some sort of special characteristics, more involved parents, whatever it is. So a gold standard study uses an experiment where basically there's a lottery. You have a bunch of people that apply for the voucher, and they do a lottery. They pull the numbers out of the basket, and some students get in and some students don't get in. So the real difference between the two groups is whether or not a student got a voucher or didn't get a voucher, because everyone showed the same inclination to apply. Everyone showed the same parental motivation. And so through this lottery, you have a random assignment experiment. So there have been 10 of these on voucher programs, and some of them have reanalyzed the same data. But if you look at the 10 programs, in DC, Charlotte, New York, Dayton, and Milwaukee, every single one of them, except for the one in New York, which has been criticized roundly by a lot of other people, shows some positive effect. Either for all students, where all students benefited maybe some in math and reading, or for some students. So these New York studies, they showed that African American students, who happen to be a very large portion of the group in the voucher program, benefited disproportionately. They received significant positive benefits in terms of academic achievement on standardized tests through participating in the voucher program. And then the one in Dayton, I believe it is, it might have been, oh sorry, it was this Bernard one. It was students from students from failing schools benefited. So if you were in a failing school and you ended up participating in the voucher program, you benefited. And that makes sense. If you're a low-income person who has few options, or if you're in a failing school, you stand to benefit more from these programs. Now, the DC program here, the standard convention in academic literature is we say something is statistically significant if it has a 5% chance of happening randomly. So if there's you're 95% sure these are positive findings, you say that's statistically significant. Well, the findings in DC were 94%. So the headline is not statistically significant, okay? Because we're only 94% sure, not 95% sure. But what they did find is that the voucher program there led to statistically significant increases in graduation rates. So students who attended the voucher program were 12 percentage points more likely to graduate from high school. And that's pretty significant. Even if there's no difference in test scores, the fact that the program was allowing students to move through school and graduate is very significant. All right, so we see that there are some benefits in terms of academic achievement. There are also possibly fiscal impacts through these private school choice programs. So as I mentioned, the DC program, I should say first that there are two ways that this could happen, through indirect savings or direct savings. In that DC program, whereas 12 percentage points higher graduation rates, Patrick Wolf at the University of Arkansas and one of my classmates, Mike McShane, who's now at American Enterprise Institute, conducted a cost-benefit analysis of the program. So they said, okay, how much money did we spend on the program, and then what did we get out of it? Increased graduation rates. Well, what does it mean when we have increased graduation rates? High school graduates are more likely to attend college. They're less likely to be on government assistance. They're less likely to become pregnant as teens. There are all these other ancillary sort of benefits that we get from high school graduates. So we get indirect benefit through voucher programs or private school programs when they improve educational outcomes. And so since they increased graduation rates, we get these benefits, and they translated it into $2.62 return for every dollar invested. And part of the reason that it was only $2.62 was because the way they structured the program. The program would have actually been a cost savings, which would have been the return would have been infinite because they would have been spending less and getting better results. But because of the way they structured the program, they got $2.62 out of every dollar they spent on the voucher program, which is a pretty good benefit. So we get those indirect savings through increased outcomes for students. We also get direct savings when one of these programs saves us money. So we can design voucher and ESA programs or even tax credit scholarship programs where we're spending less money than we're spending on the traditional public school. So in Missouri, we spend about $9,600 per pupil. And about 30-something% of that comes from the state, although it should really be higher. If you want to get into the funding formula, we could talk about that later. So about 30-something% comes from the state. And so if we say, okay, this is how much the state spends, if the voucher is less than that, then that can result in savings for us. I'm getting a sign that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move past the fiscal impacts. But I want to say fiscal impacts depend on how you structure the voucher program. So when someone says, well, we can't afford that, well, it's very possible we could, and we could generate savings from it if we design it in an appropriate way. As I mentioned earlier, these programs can be targeted at disadvantaged students. So disadvantaged students oftentimes benefit from these programs. But the point I really want to bring home is the real benefit from these programs. Yes, they benefit students by increasing outcomes. Yes, they can have a positive impact on our state budget by allowing us to have cost savings. Yes, we can target them and we can impact disadvantaged students and help them to have better outcomes. But in my opinion, the real benefit comes from increasing liberty. So we allow parents to have greater control of where their kids go to school and the education that they receive. And what I put up here is that school choice is not just about improving test scores. Now, don't get me wrong. I want better test scores. I want my kids to do well on tests, and I want your kids and grandkids to do well on tests and other kids to do well on tests. But it's not just about tests. It's about kids, right? That's what school's about. These are my kids. Last year, I had a very difficult problem with my kids' school. It was a traditional public school in Northwest Arkansas. You have the story in front of you. I didn't like how they were teaching my kids math. They were teaching them math through a discovery learning approach, which I found to be very ineffective, very cumbersome. I didn't think my kids were learning. My wife was also a teacher in the district. So luckily, the district paid her well enough that mid-year we pulled our kids out and were able to afford to put them into a private school. But most of the other families in that school didn't have that option because they didn't have the money to be able to afford private schools. So it wasn't that the school was doing really poorly. They weren't a failing school. But I had disagreements with him, and I tried to make changes in my school, the kids' school, which you could read about, but I was unable to do so. What private school choice does, what one of these programs do, is give parents the option. They give them the power to say to, if this school isn't meeting my child's needs, I can use these dollars to go someplace else that is going to serve my child better. Now, the last thing I want to close with is, this is the argument I often hear in Missouri. What you're saying is fine for St. Louis and Kansas City. But here in Columbia and the rest of the state, we don't need these types of programs. These are city problems. These are solutions to city problems. Well, I plotted, let me pull up my map here. Oh, this is where I was going to tell you what I just told you. I already told you that. I plotted a map of every, and I wish this showed up better, of every private school in Missouri from a national survey collected by the National Center for Education Statistics in 2010. And we did a 10-mile radius around every school. And I'll leave it up here, and if you want to come up later, you can see where all the private schools are. Throughout the state, except for in very sparsely populated areas, there are private schools within 10 miles of of a vast majority of students in Missouri. If we put into place a program like this, very many families are going to have an additional option. An option that they didn't have before because they might not have been able to afford it. So when we think about these problems, yes, they may benefit St. Louis and Kansas City because they have more options, but I really think that throughout the state, families could benefit from having an additional option. And with a program like this, we might also see more schools come into the market to serve more students because they'll have more opportunities with more students having the means to afford those schools. So private school choice, the programs that I've talked about aren't just city solutions to city problems. I think they're really viable solutions to problems for all Missourians and solutions that give all Missourians more choices in how their child is educated. So I tried to leave some time here for questions. So
let's just say